The air in the motel corridor, ice machine humming, no room numbers, tasted like stale cigarettes and desperation. I pulled my worn duffel bag tighter, the rough canvas digging into my shoulder. Each step echoed, a lonely percussion in the suffocating quiet. This was my life, transient, anonymous, a series of anonymous doors leading to anonymous nights. My phone buzzed, a jolt against my thigh, probably another bill collector. I ignored it. My apartment had been evicted last week. A landlord with eyes like chipped obsidian had given me 24 hours. 24 hours to pack a life into a duffel bag and a backpack. Since then, it's been a blur of cheap lodgings and even cheaper meals. This place, with its peeling wallpaper and the persistent, maddening hum of the ice machine, was the latest. The motel corridor, ice machine humming, no room numbers was more than just a description. It was becoming my personal hell. Then the letter arrived. Thick cream-colored paper, the kind that whispers of old money and forgotten lineages. My name typed in an elegant, old-fashioned font. My address, the temporary one I'd scribbled on a crumpled napkin at a diner. It was from a law firm I'd never heard of, deep in some city I'd never visited. Inside, the news was almost comical in its absurdity. A relative, thrice removed, a great-aunt or something equally obscure, died, and I, Raj, the perpetual renter, the guy who juggled credit cards just to keep the lights on, was the sole heir. The inheritance wasn't just money, it was property, a sprawling estate, a mansion. The lawyer, a man named Mr. Abernathy, sounded like he was gargling gravel when he finally got me on the phone. He spoke in hushed tones as if the very mention of the inheritance might attract unwanted attention. "The estate is substantial, Mr. Raj," he'd rasp, "and the terms of the will are quite specific. I must reside there personally for a period of no less than 1 year. Should I fulfill this condition, the entirety of the fortune will be yours. Failure to do so? Well, it reverts to a charitable trust." A charitable trust, as if my great-aunt had known my precarious situation, my desperate need, or perhaps it was a cruel joke. The address provided was miles from anywhere, a place called Blackwood Manor. The name itself sent a shiver down my spine, a sensation wholly alien to the usual gnawing anxiety of poverty. I walked to the end of the motel corridor, ice machine humming, no room numbers. The air grew colder. A damp, earthy smell like disturbed soil began to creep in, mingling with the usual motel funk. It was impossible. The ice machine was the only source of any mechanical noise, and it was a steady, predictable drone. Yet I could almost hear something else. A faint, irregular scratching like claws on wood from somewhere behind the walls. My breath hitched. I told myself it was the building settling, old pipes groaning, but the smell. It was stronger now, and the scratching. It seemed to be getting closer. I gripped the handle of my duffel bag, my grip tight. The will, the mansion, the promise of wealth that felt too good to be true. It was a trap, wasn't it? A gilded cage waiting to snap shut, Mr. Abernathy had been cagey about the details of the manor. He'd said it was remote, secluded. He'd rushed me through the paperwork, his voice tight with what sounded like genuine fear. He'd stressed the importance of the 1-year residency. "The will is very clear, Mr. Raj. I must be in situ." I looked back down the impossibly long motel corridor, ice machine humming, no room numbers. The ice machine's drone seemed to deepen, to vibrate in my bones. The scratching had stopped, replaced by a new sound. It wasn't words, not exactly. More like the sound of dry leaves skittering across a stone floor or the rasp of 1,000 tiny insects moving in unison. Was I already losing my mind? This was what poverty did, I'd always told myself. It frayed my nerves, made I see things, but this felt different. This felt intentional, like something was testing the waters, seeing if I was susceptible. I had a decision to make. A monumental decision, born out of desperation and a cryptic legal document. Do I run from this potential fortune, this terrifying inheritance, and return to the familiar, soul-crushing grind of my current existence? The air in the motel corridor, ice machine humming, no room numbers, felt thick with anticipation, as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for my answer. And I, Raj, felt a strange, morbid curiosity begin to bloom in the desolate landscape of my fear. What if this was my only chance? But at what cost? The motel corridor, ice machine humming, no room numbers, stretched on. The whisper, a dry rustle like dead leaves skittering across concrete, had faded, gone. Just the relentless thrum of the ice machine, a sound that had become the only constant in this strange, unnumbered place. I shook my head, trying to dislodge the lingering unease. It was just the stress, I told myself. The move, the inheritance, the sheer absurdity of it all. My fingers, still stiff from the long drive, fumbled with the key card. Finally, a click. The door swung inward, revealing a room that smelled faintly of stale cigarette smoke and something metallic, like old pennies. The next morning, the light, when it finally bled through the grimy motel blinds, felt like an accusation. I packed quickly, the cryptic will tucked into my wallet, a promise of wealth that felt increasingly hollow. The mansion, that was the real prize or the real curse. My distant relative, a name I'd never heard whispered in family gatherings, had left me this sprawling, decaying monument to solitude. The lawyer had been vague, his eyes darting around his sterile office as if afraid of being overheard. A significant estate, he'd murmured, but it comes with responsibilities. He'd handed me the keys, heavy and ornate, and a single, yellowed photograph of a house that looked like it was actively trying to sink into the earth. The drive to the estate was long, the roads narrowing, the trees crowding in, their branches clawing at the sky. When the gates finally loomed, wrought iron twisted into grotesque shapes, I felt a prickle of apprehension. They creaked open with a groan that echoed through the silent countryside. The house itself was a silhouette against the bruised twilight sky. It was larger than I'd imagined, a hulking, Gothic beast. Inside, the air was thick, stagnant, tasting of dust and decay. I walked through cavernous rooms, each one more desolate than the last. Faded tapestries clung to the walls, their patterns obscured by time and mildew. Furniture lay draped in white sheets like forgotten corpses. My first night was a symphony of creaks and groans. The old house settling, I told myself, wind whistling through unseen cracks. But the sounds were too deliberate. A faint scratching from within the walls, like tiny claws scrabbling for purchase. A low thud from the floor above, as if something heavy had been dropped. I sat up in the massive four-poster bed, the sheets feeling unnervingly damp against my skin. My own breathing seemed deafening in the stillness. In the days that followed, the subtle disturbances intensified. Doors I'd closed would be found ajar. Objects would shift, not dramatically, but just enough to make me question my own memory. A book I'd left on the bedside table would be on the floor. A chair I'd pushed in would be pulled out. I started to feel watched, an invisible presence lingering just beyond my peripheral vision. The sheer size of the house, once an enticing prospect, now felt like a cage. One afternoon, while exploring the dusty library, a room filled with the musty scent of decaying paper, I noticed a strange pattern on the wallpaper. It was subtle, almost subliminal, a repeating motif of intertwined vines that seemed to writhe and twist the longer I looked. The vines, I realized with a jolt, were not just vines. They were tendrils grasping, reaching, and within their loops, barely discernible, were faces. Small, contorted faces, mouths open in silent screams. I snatched my hand back, my heart racing. It was just a design, I insisted, a trick of the light, the fatigue playing tricks on my eyes. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and blood orange, I stood by one of the grand, arched windows in the drawing room. The glass was thick, distorted, making the world outside appear warped and unreal. A faint mist was beginning to creep across the lawns, blurring the edges of the gnarled trees. As I watched, a single skeletal branch, silhouetted against the dying light, seemed to reach out to tap against the pane, a deliberate, rhythmic sound. Tap, tap, tap. I held my breath, straining to hear over the pounding in my ears. It sounded like a signal, but who or what was signaling, and to whom? I shook my head, the phantom whisper still prickling the back of my neck. It had been a sound that promised secrets, a brittle promise that dissolved into the air as quickly as it formed. The ice machine's monotonous drone was a comfort, a predictable rhythm in the disorienting silence that followed. I blinked, trying to clear my vision. The walls seemed to ripple just for a second, like heat rising from asphalt. My hand tightened on the worn leather grip of my duffel bag. This place. It was designed to unnerve, I knew that. The lack of numbers, the endless stretch of identical doors. But it wasn't just the architecture. It was the feeling. A heavy, suffocating presence that pressed in from all sides, stealing the breath from my lungs. Raj, I reminded myself. I here for a reason. The will, the fortune. It was all supposed to be waiting for me, a reward for deciphering the cryptic clauses. But this felt like a trap. I forced myself to move, my footsteps unnervingly loud on the threadbare carpet. Each door I passed was a blank slate, offering no hint of what lay behind it. I tried the handle of the nearest one, locked. The next. A knot of anxiety began to coil in my stomach. Had I been given the wrong key? Or was this some elaborate test designed to break me before I even reached the prize? My phone. I fumbled for it, the smooth glass cool against my clammy palm. No signal, of course. I'd noticed it earlier, a faint, flickering bar that had vanished completely about an hour ago. I tried calling the estate lawyer, no answer. I tried his office number, dead air. A wave of panic, sharp and sudden, washed over me. I was cut off, completely. The thought was a physical blow. Back at the mansion, the isolation had been a gradual creep, a slow tightening of invisible chains. Here it was immediate, brutal. I slumped against the wall, the cheap wallpaper rough against my cheek. The scent of stale cigarette smoke and something else. Something musty, like old paper left to rot, filled my nostrils. It was supposed to be my home now, my inheritance. But the memories were already starting to fray, the edges blurring. Had I imagined it? Feeling of being watched? A faint creak echoed from further down the corridor. My head snapped up. I strained my ears, listening, just the relentless hum of the ice machine, but the creak had been distinct, the sound of something heavy shifting. I told myself it was the building settling, the old plumbing groaning, but the sound had been too deliberate, too organic. I pushed myself off the wall, my legs feeling unsteady. I needed to find my room. I needed a place to lie down, to think, to shake off this creeping unease. I started walking again, faster this time, my eyes darting from door to door. The corridor seemed to lengthen, the end receding with every step I took. The air grew heavier, thicker, making each breath a conscious effort. It was like walking through water, a viscous, unseen resistance pushing back against me. Then I saw it. A door, slightly ajar. My initial instinct was to recoil, to keep moving, to find a numbered room, a place that felt less inviting, but a morbid curiosity, a desperate hope that this was my room propelled me forward. I reached out, my hand trembling, and pushed the door open further. I took a step inside, my foot landing on a surface that felt strangely soft, yielding. I flinched back, my breath catching in my throat. What was that? I couldn't see my own hands in front of my face. A low scraping sound started, coming from the far corner of the room. Deliberate, like something being dragged across a rough floor. My skin crawled. My mind raced, conjuring images I desperately tried to suppress. Images of things that shouldn't exist, things I'd seen glimpsed in the periphery of my vision back at the mansion. Things that slithered, things that clawed. I backed away, my heel catching on something unseen. I stumbled, my arms flailing for balance. The scraping stopped. A profound silence descended, more terrifying than the sound itself. My own breathing was ragged, harsh in the stillness. I wanted to run, to bolt back into the corridor, but my feet felt rooted to the floor. A soft, wet chuckle. It wasn't human. It was a gurgle, a choked sound that promised a pain I couldn't begin to comprehend. It was the sound of something that had been waiting, something that had finally found what it was looking for. What was in that room with me? The motel corridor, ice machine humming, no room numbers, stretched on, an endless, beige purgatory. I'd been standing there for what felt like hours, the cool, sterile air doing nothing to dissipate the prickling unease that had settled on my skin. The hum of the ice machine was a dull throb, a mechanical heartbeat in the oppressive silence. I finally turned away, my footsteps echoing too loudly on the worn linoleum. The door to my room, identical to all the others, felt like a small victory, a temporary reprieve. Inside, the air was thick with the stale scent of disinfectant and something else, something faintly metallic like old pennies. I sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress, my mind a frantic scramble. The whisper. It had been so distinct, so close. Not a voice I recognized, but a texture of sound, like dry leaves skittering across stone. It had spoken a name that felt both familiar and utterly alien, a name I couldn't quite grasp. Was I losing it? Was this the stress, the isolation, the sheer wrongness of that house finally catching up to me? I needed to get back to the mansion. I was a writer, after all, or at least I used to be. But here in this sterile, anonymous space, the old hunger was stirring, a need to understand, to dissect, to know. I pulled out the worn, leather-bound journal I'd found tucked away in the library, its pages brittle with age. The ink was faded, the handwriting spidery and erratic. It belonged to a previous inhabitant, someone who had clearly succumbed to the house's suffocating embrace. The entries were fragmented, filled with a growing paranoia, with disjointed observations about the house's breathing, its watching. One passage, dated decades ago, caught my eye. The walls do not simply hold the past, they are the past. They remember, and they hunger for more. Hunger. That word echoed the feeling I'd had in the main hall, the sense of being consumed. I flipped through more pages, my heart picking up a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The entries grew more desperate, more incoherent. The writer had described a specific room, a study on the second floor, where the air was always heavy, where the silence was a palpable weight. But to listen too long is to invite it in. I closed the journal, my hands trembling. The ice machine's drone seemed to amplify, filling the small room with its relentless, monotonous pulse. The urge to return to the mansion was becoming overwhelming. I had to see that study. I had to push deeper, despite the gnawing fear that was beginning to twist itself around my gut. The drive back was a blur. The mansion loomed, a skeletal silhouette against the bruised twilight sky. As I parked the car, the familiar, suffocating silence descended. I entered the house, the heavy oak door groaning shut behind me with a resounding thud. I fumbled for the lantern I kept by the door, its beam cutting a shaky swath through the gloom. Dust motes danced in the light like spectral insects. My steps were deliberate, each one measured. The wood creaked a protest with every ascent, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness. The air was stagnant, heavy with an unseen presence. I found the study, its door slightly ajar. A faint, musty odor like forgotten books and dried blood seeped from within. Taking a deep, steadying breath, I pushed the door open. A large, ornate desk dominated the center of the room, its surface cluttered with yellowed papers and a dried-up inkwell. I moved further into the room, my boots crunching on something brittle on the floor. I lowered the lantern. It was a scattering of what looked like dried leaves, impossibly out of place in this sealed-off space. As I swept the beam across the room, my breath hitched. It depicted a woman, her face gaunt, her eyes wide with an expression that was a terrifying blend of fear and accusation. It was her hair, and the eyes. They were my eyes. Was this a trick of the light? A figment of my overstimulated imagination? I felt a prickling sensation on my scalp, as if something unseen were reaching out to me. The woman in the portrait seemed to stare directly at me, her painted lips parted in a silent scream. And then from the corner of the room, a faint rustling sound, like dry leaves skittering across stone. The hum of the ice machine was a physical presence, a low thrumming that vibrated through the thin carpet and up my legs. It was the only sound in the motel corridor, a stark contrast to the suffocating silence I'd fled. No room numbers adorned the doors, just a uniform, faded beige that mirrored the peeling paint. I leaned my forehead against the cool, vibrating metal of the ice machine, the chill seeping into my skin. The journal lay heavy in my pocket, a secret I couldn't yet articulate. The study, the hidden compartment. The words scrawled in that frantic hand felt like a physical weight in my mind. It watches, it waits. I dismissed it as the ravings of a man lost to his own demons, but now I wasn't so sure. The house, it felt alive, not in the way a building can feel ancient or imposing, but in a way that prickled the hairs on my arms, a constant, subtle awareness. I pushed off the machine, the sudden movement making me dizzy. My reflection in the polished chrome of the ice dispenser was gaunt, my eyes wide and darting. I looked like a man who hadn't slept in days, which wasn't far from the truth. The will, the promise of wealth. It was a siren song luring me into... What? I walked down the corridor, my footsteps echoing unnaturally loud. Each door was a mystery, a potential trap. I felt a desperate need to escape, to put miles between me and that sprawling, brooding edifice on the hill. But the journal pulled me back. It spoke of a power, a hunger, and it spoke of me. The ink on the last few pages had bled, as if written in haste or perhaps in tears. It feeds on stillness. I had told myself it was stress, exhaustion, my mind playing tricks, but the ice machine's hum, so steady, so mechanical, was a comfort. It was real. It was predictable, unlike the house. I stopped at the end of the corridor, a dead end with a fire escape door. The air here was thick with the stale scent of cigarette smoke and something else, something vaguely metallic like old pennies. I gripped the journal through the fabric of my jacket. It was more than just a house. It was a predator. I replayed the moment I'd found the hidden compartment. The smooth, cool wood of the desk, the faint outline of the panel, the almost imperceptible click as it sprang open, the musty smell of old paper, the faint scent of lavender that clung to the journal itself. And then the words. "You are the key." What key? A key to what and why me? I was just Raj, a man who'd inherited a fortune and a burden he couldn't comprehend. I had no special lineage, no hidden talents, or so I thought. My gaze drifted back down the empty corridor. The hum of the ice machine seemed to grow louder, more insistent, like a heartbeat slowing and then picking up speed. It was a mechanical heartbeat, a stark contrast to the chaotic rhythm that had begun to pound in my own chest. I thought of the feeling of the house settling, a deep creak that wasn't just the groaning of old timbers. It was a sigh, a shift, like a great beast stirring in its sleep. The journal had mentioned specific rooms, the library with its suffocating scent of decaying paper and leather. The master bedroom, where the air always felt heavy, as if someone had just exhaled there, and the study. Always the study. A sudden gust of wind rattled the fire escape door, making me jump. My breath hitched. I scanned the corridor again, the uniform beige doors suddenly menacing. There was that a flicker of movement at the far end? No, just the light. The cheap, flickering fluorescent tubes overhead playing tricks, but the feeling persisted. the prickling sensation on my neck, the undeniable certainty that I was not alone even here miles away from the mansion. The ice machine continued its relentless drone, an anchor in the rising tide of my unease. It was a sound that said, "This is real, this is tangible." But what about the other things? Were they real too, or was the house merely a vessel, a stage for my own unraveling mind? I took a deep, shaky breath. The metallic tang in the air seemed stronger now. I could almost taste it. "It wants you to stay." My own breathing seemed deafening. And then from behind one of the doors, a faint, rhythmic scratching began. Not a frantic scratching, but a slow, deliberate one, like fingernails on wood or something trying to get out. What was behind that door, and why did it sound so much like my own desperate attempts to escape? The silence after the ice machine died was a physical weight. It pressed against my eardrums, amplifying the blood rushing in my own head. The scratching, it was still there, a soft, persistent scrape. Scrape, scrape. From behind the door to my left. It wasn't loud, not enough to be alarming in any normal circumstance, but here in this suffocating quiet, it felt like a drill boring into my skull. I remembered the old man's voice, the one from the recording, his raspy whisper about the house feeding. Feeding on what? My sanity, my fear. It felt like it was feeding on the quiet itself, coaxing sounds out of nothing. My hand, slick with sweat, fumbled for the flashlight on the rickety bedside table. The beam, weak and flickering, cut a shaky path down the motel corridor, ice machine humming, no room numbers. The peeling wallpaper, a sickly floral pattern I hadn't noticed before, seemed to writhe in the intermittent light. Each flower, I swore, had an eye. The scratching stopped, just like that. One moment, the steady rhythm, the next, absolute stillness. Silence was worse. It was the pause before the strike, the held breath of a predator. My own breath hitched. I strained to hear anything at all. The distant drone of highway traffic, a creak from the building's ancient structure, nothing. Only the echo of my own frantic pulse in my ears. I had to get out. The will, the money, the cryptic warnings, it was all a trap. The mansion wasn't a prize, it was a prison. And this motel corridor, ice machine humming, no room numbers, was just another layer of it. I needed to find a way to break free. My eyes darted to the end of the corridor, a door. It looked solid, real, a potential exit. I pushed myself off the bed, my legs stiff and trembling. As I took a step, a soft whimper echoed from behind the door where the scratching had been. It was a child's whimper, small and helpless. My stomach twisted. I'd heard that sound before in my dreams. A memory I'd buried deep, the sound of my younger sister, lost in a crowd at a fairground years ago. I could almost see her face, her tear-streaked cheeks, her wide, frightened eyes. The house knew. It knew my deepest shame, my most potent fear. It was using it to keep me here, to paralyze me. I forced myself to look away from the door. That was my focus. I walked towards it, each step a deliberate act of defiance. It felt like stepping into a freezer. My fingers brushed against the cool, smooth wood of the door. It was heavier than it looked. I pushed. It didn't budge. I pushed harder, putting my shoulder into it. Still nothing. It was as if it were sealed shut. Then a voice, not from the corridor, but from inside my own head, or so it seemed. It was the old man's voice again, but softer, almost seductive. "I seek wealth, Raj, but true wealth lies in understanding, in embracing what is hidden." What was hidden, I'd seen enough. This wasn't understanding, it was torment. I turned back, my gaze falling on the door with the whimpering child. My heart ached with a familiar, sickening lurch. I'd find something else, something that wore her face. But the thought of leaving her, of abandoning her to whatever was in there, was unbearable. It was the echo of my lifelong guilt. My hand reached for the doorknob. I hesitated. The motel corridor, ice machine humming, no room numbers, seemed to stretch out endlessly before me. The air was thick with the phantom scent of stale cigarette smoke and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet. What if opening the door was the only way out? What if the house wanted me to choose, to succumb to my fear or to confront it no matter the cost? The whimper stopped. A new sound replaced it, a soft, wet thud followed by a low, guttural growl. It was no longer the sound of a child. My fingers tightened around the doorknob. The metal was biting into my palm. I could feel a faint vibration from within, a low thrumming that resonated in my bones. The house was waiting. Was I going to give it what it wanted? The floorboards groaned under my weight, each step a confession of my intrusion. I was back in the main hall, the dust motes dancing in the slivers of moonlight that pierced the grimy windows. The will. It was always the will, wasn't it? The promise of wealth, the lure that had dragged me into this suffocating embrace. Now, it felt like a trap sprung shut. The child's whimpers from behind that door. They weren't just sounds. They were echoes of something I'd tried to bury, something sharp and jagged that had lodged itself in my chest years ago. I ran a hand over the peeling wallpaper, its floral pattern faded into a sickly gray. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and acrid like old pennies left out in the rain. A draft slithered across my skin, raising gooseflesh despite the stifling stillness. I told myself it was just the house settling, the wind finding its way through broken panes. But the wind didn't carry that subtle, rhythmic thump-thump-thump that seemed to originate from the very heart of the mansion. My determination, once a solid shield, now felt brittle. I needed to understand, not just to escape, but to know. The cryptic clauses of the will spoke of a final testament, a truth concealed within the stones. Was this the truth? These suffocating rooms, these phantom sounds? I pressed my palm against the wall, feeling the cold, rough plaster. It was solid, real. Yet the impression of a face, gaunt and hollow-eyed, seemed to press back against my hand. I snatched my hand away as if burned. The whimpering intensified, a thin, reedy sound that clawed at my nerves. It was coming from the room with the child. I couldn't ignore it. Not anymore. My breath hitched. Each footfall towards that door was a step into the unknown, a deliberate surrender to whatever was waiting. The wood of the door was warped, splintered, as if something had tried to claw its way out from within. I hesitated, my fingers hovering inches from the tarnished brass doorknob. Taking a shuddering breath, I turned the knob. It grated against my palm, a protest against being opened. The door swung inward with a long, drawn-out squeal, revealing not a room, but a narrow, winding staircase descending into absolute blackness. The whimpering stopped abruptly. The metallic tang in the air grew stronger, sharper. I peered down, my eyes straining. Nothing, but I felt it, a presence, a patient, waiting thing. My mind raced, conjuring images of what could lie below, damp earth, rotting wood, things that scuttled, things that watched. The wealth. It was a lie, a bait. The real inheritance was this. My resolve wavered. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to flee into the night, to forget the cryptic words and the phantom wealth. It was a different kind of fear, a fear of the unfinished, the unknown. I had to see. I had to know what lay at the bottom of that descent. My hand fumbled for the flashlight in my pocket. Cobwebs, thick as shrouds, brushed against my face, clinging to my hair and eyelashes. The stairs were uneven, some treads missing entirely, forcing me to leap precariously. Each landing was a small victory, each step down a surrender. The thump-thump-thump returned, louder now, a slow, deliberate beat that seemed to resonate within my own bones. It wasn't just a sound, it was a pulse, the pulse of the house. Then the flashlight beam caught something, a glint of metal. Further down, embedded in the rough-hewn wall, was a small, rusted grate. Through its bars, I could see nothing, but the air that seeped from it was thick with that cloying sweetness, and beneath it, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This was it. The core, the place where the house's secrets festered, the sweetness intensified, so potent it made my head swim. It was a perfume of decay, a siren song of oblivion. I leaned closer, my breath catching in my throat. The tremor grew stronger, vibrating through the stone beneath my feet. It wasn't water. I knew that with a certainty that froze my blood. What was it, and what was it dripping onto? I was standing on the precipice, the weight of the house pressing down, the air thick with the scent of rot and something unspeakably sweet. My flashlight beam flickered, threatening to die. I could feel its attention, a heavy, suffocating gaze. This was not a place for the living. But I was still here, wasn't I? The thought of turning back felt like a betrayal of myself, of the desperate hope that had brought me here. But the thought of moving forward, it was a plunge into a madness I couldn't comprehend. The drip came again, closer this time, and the sweetness. It was overwhelming. Was I breathing it in? Was it filling my lungs, my mind? I felt a strange lethargy creep over me, a tempting surrender. The house was offering a release, a quiet end, but I resisted. I had to. The walls seemed to pulse with a faint, internal light, an illusion of my frayed nerves or something more. I pressed my ear to the cold stone, trying to decipher the rhythm of the thump-thump-thump. It was a language I didn't understand, a lullaby of death. Then I saw it. Scratched into the stone near the grate, barely visible, were a series of symbols. I'd seen them before in a forgotten dream, a nightmare I'd long since pushed away. What did they mean? Why were they here in this suffocating pit? The sweetness in the air was now so potent it burned my nostrils. I took a step back, my boots scraping against the rough stone. The grate rattled. What was it trying to tell me? The air in the main hall tasted like old pennies and regret. I ran a hand over the rough, splintered wood of the banister, the same banister that had felt slick with an unseen moisture just moments ago. The moonlight, weak as it was, offered no comfort. It merely highlighted the decay, the gaping maw of the staircase leading to... where? I didn't know. I didn't want to know. But the will, that damned, gilded piece of paper, pulsed in my pocket, a constant, insistent reminder of why I was here. Immense wealth. It had been the hook, the bait, and now I was the fish, writhing on the line in the dark, hungry waters of Blackwood Manor. I needed to get out. That thought, a desperate whisper, had been my constant companion for days. But every door seemed to lead back here to this hall. Every window, even those I'd painstakingly cleaned, showed only the same impenetrable wall of ancient trees, their branches like skeletal fingers clawing at the glass. The silence was the worst. It wasn't an absence of noise, but a presence, a suffocating blanket that pressed in on my eardrums, amplifying the frantic thudding of my own heart. I turned towards the grand fireplace, its soot-stained maw gaping. The logs, long since turned to ash, held no warmth. It was never there when I looked directly, of course. That was its game, to keep me perpetually off balance, chasing phantoms. The will. I pulled it out, the parchment brittle and yellowed. The words seemed to shift, to rearrange themselves as I looked. And to my dearest Raj, whom I have never had the pleasure of meeting, I bequeath all my worldly possessions, contingent upon my residing within Blackwood Manor for the duration of 1 full calendar year, commencing upon the reading of this will. Should I fail to meet this condition, all shall be forfeit, and the true legacy of Blackwood will remain with. The rest was smudged, illegible, a cruel joke. I crumpled the paper in my fist. A year. I'd only been here a month, but it felt like an eternity. The house had been slowly, methodically dismantling me. Then came the dreams, vivid and terrifying, pulling me back to moments I'd tried to bury deep within myself. The accident, the faces, my father's, my breath hitched. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. The temperature plummeted. I could feel it now, a prickling sensation on my skin like 1,000 tiny needles. They were no longer just an absence of light. They had substance, a palpable weight. I backed away, my boots skidding on the polished yet grimy floor. The portraits on the walls, the stern, unsmiling faces of my ancestors seemed to watch me with a newfound malice. Their painted eyes followed my every move. One, a woman with a severe bun and a viper's smile, seemed to sneer. I could almost hear her laughter, a rustling sound that scraped against my nerves. What do I want? I finally managed, my voice a raw rasp. It was a deliberate, expectant hush. The entity, whatever it was waiting for me to break, waiting for me to give in to the fear. I stumbled backward, my hand scrabbling for the heavy oak door that led to the kitchens. It wouldn't open. I'd tried it 100 times. It was always locked, always sealed. But this time, as my fingers brushed against the cold metal of the handle, I felt a tremor run through the wood. A low groan, like a wounded beast, emanated from within the house itself. They flowed, not like smoke, but like viscous tar pooling at the base of the staircase. They began to rise, to take shape. I could feel its gaze, 1,000 unseen eyes boring into me. It fed on my fear, I knew that now. The more I panicked, the stronger it became. I forced myself to stand still, to breathe in, out. The air was frigid, each inhale burning my lungs. I focused on the will still clutched in my hand, the wealth. It was a lie, wasn't it? A trap. But what if? What if there was something else, a way out? I could smell it, a cloying, sweet scent like decaying flowers. It was the smell of Blackwood Manor, the scent of its hunger. I remembered the cryptic notes in the margins of the will, scribbled in a spidery hand. The price of admission is steep, but the exit is a matter of understanding. Understanding what? I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the encroaching blackness. I thought of the outside world, of sunlight, of laughter, of escape, but the house wouldn't let me forget. Raj, come join us. My knees buckled, but then a flicker, a memory, my father, his face etched with worry, handing me a small, tarnished silver locket. This will protect I, son, he'd said. Always remember who I am. I dismissed it then, a childish trinket, but now. My hand fumbled inside my shirt, searching for the chain. My fingers closed around the cool metal. I pulled it out. The locket, intricately carved with an unfamiliar crest, felt warm against my skin. As I opened it, a faint, ethereal glow emanated from within. It hissed, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage. The cloying scent of decay receded. The entity was vulnerable. It was afraid, but why? What was in this locket that could possibly deter a force that had held this manor captive for centuries? Was this the understanding the will spoke of? And if so, what was the true nature of this thing that now writhed before me, its form flickering like a dying flame? It clung to my tongue, a gritty reminder of where I was, and more importantly, where I wasn't. My fingers traced the worn linoleum, the sticky residue beneath my nail, a familiar, mundane discomfort. It was a stark contrast to the slick, viscous horror that had coated my hands just when, hours ago, days, time had become a concept as fluid and unreliable as the shadows in Blackwood Manor. I stood there, a phantom in the fluorescent glare, the weight of the locket still a phantom warmth against my chest, though I'd long since tucked it away. The glow had faded, of course. It always did. but the memory of it, of the hissing recoil, was burned into my retinas. The manor, for that brief, agonizing moment, had flinched. It had acknowledged a force stronger than its own suffocating malice. My reflection in a grimy window pane showed a stranger. My eyes, once bright with a naive ambition, were hollowed, rimmed with a permanent fatigue that no amount of sleep could ever erase. My jaw was perpetually clenched, a habit born of bracing for impacts that never quite came, but always felt imminent. Blackwood Manor had chipped away at me, not with brute force, but with 1,000 tiny erosions. It had shown me my deepest, most shameful fears, twisted them, and then held them up to me like grotesque trophies. I took a breath, the stale air doing little to fill my lungs. My muscles ached, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that felt like it had seeped into my very marrow. The will, it had all been a lure, a gilded cage. The real inheritance wasn't the sprawling, decaying edifice, but the thing that resided within it. The thing that fed on fear, the locket. It was the key, I knew that now. Not a weapon, not a shield, but a key, the crest. It was the symbol of the family that had bound themselves to the house, a pact made generations ago. My distant relative, whoever they were, had left me more than just a burden. They had left me a legacy of servitude, a duty to contain asterisk. I'd managed to break free, not by destroying the manor. That felt impossible, like trying to unring a bell or unspill ink, but by understanding. The ice machine word, a sudden sharp noise that made me jump. My hand went instinctively to my chest, to where the locket lay hidden. It was still there. It was always there, but the warmth was gone. The house was no longer actively trying to consume me. It was waiting. I had left. I hadn't looked back. I couldn't. The journey to this anonymous motel had been a blur of gas station coffee and furtive glances in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the silhouette of the manor rising from the horizon. But there was nothing. Just endless flat stretches of highway and the gnawing emptiness in my gut. What had I truly accomplished? I had survived. I had escaped. But the manor was still there, a festering wound on the landscape. It wasn't a victory, not in the way I'd once imagined. It was a reprieve, a temporary ceasefire. The hum of the ice machine seemed to deepen, a low thrum that vibrated through the soles of my worn shoes. It was a sound of mechanical repetition, of endless cycles. Much like the cycle I had been born into, the cycle I had momentarily broken. I pulled my collar tighter, the thin fabric offering no real comfort. The outside world felt alien, too bright, too loud, too normal. How could I ever explain what had happened? Who would believe me? They would see the haunted look in my eyes, the tremor in my hands, and they would offer pity or worse, suspicion. I was free, yes, but the freedom felt like a different kind of cage. A cage built of memory, of the knowledge of what lurked just beyond the veil of ordinary perception. The manor was waiting, and the locket, warm and inert against my skin, was a promise. I looked down the endless corridor, the identical doors a blur of sameness, each one potentially holding a stranger, a secret, a fear waiting to be unearthed. I had thought escaping the house would be the end, but I was beginning to suspect it was just the beginning of a different kind of haunting. Was this the price of survival?